We begin the 1990s with a president from the 1980s. George H.W. Bush had been Ronald Reagan's faithful vice president for 8 years. In 1988, he was easily elected on the coattails of the very popular Reagan presidency. And it is during the 1990s, though, that we begin to see the decade in a new way. The Cold War ends, other conflicts arise, new presidents come in. A very, very different decade that starts with the end of the Cold War and the beginning of a whole new era in not only American history, but also world history. In August of 1990, troops under the command of the Iraqi leader Saddam Hussein invaded the small country of Kuwait, the small oil-rich country right on the Persian Gulf. The intention was to depress world oil prices and take more control of this very valuable resource. In response to the sovereign nation being invaded by one of its neighbors, and in response to the threat of this very valuable resource being restricted, the United States, at the head of a world coalition, took arms up against Iraq. Now, it's really important to note here is that the first Persian Gulf War, which begins after the invasion of Kuwait, does so after George H.W. Bush goes to the United Nations and actually forms this world coalition of a number of different countries that all band together to push Iraq back out of the country of Kuwait. The American as well as international effort was based out of the neighboring country of Saudi Arabia. And initially we began with what was called Operation Desert Shield, where a number of air attacks and sanctions were placed upon the country of Iraq. Now, in a very kind of different way of dealing with international disputes, Bush, instead of going at it all alone, as America had during the Reagan years and even going back further and during Vietnam, Bush, as we said, gathered an international coalition to strike back against Iraq, which made this very, very different. Made George H.W. Bush quite a more world figure than just an American president during this conflict. Eventually, though, the question was, when were American troops actually going to go in? And starting about sometime later, some months later, it came to actually full on attacking the Iraqi forces. This became known as Operation Desert Storm. Desert Storm was the offensive attack led by General Norman Schwarzkopf against the Iraqi forces. Now, going into this, a lot of people had this idea that the Iraqi troops were these hardened troops after years and years and years of fighting with next door neighbor Iran. What people did not know, though, was that these troops were literally petrified of the American forces that were bearing down on them. We had over 300,000 American, British, and French troops that had moved into Saudi Arabia, along with several other countries that were teaming up with those three main Western superpowers. From the time that Desert Storm actually started, from the initiating of the offensive attacks, and this was preceded by air attacks, and then ground forces started moving in, boots on the ground. It was less. It was only about 100 hours or so before the war, if you want to even call it that, was over. Because by the time the Americans actually started marching into Kuwait and then further into Iraq, they found that the Iraqi military was in sorry condition. And the result was almost complete and immediate surrender by all Iraqi forces, despite the fact that their leader was calling for their immediate surrender. And it was all but over. And so the Persian Gulf War really kind of restored America's position as the world's really sole superpower at the time. Unfortunate, though, for George H.W. Bush, the economic crisis that we mentioned at the end of our PowerPoint on the 1980s overshadowed any kind of good public relations created by the victory in Kuwait and Iraq. And so by the time the election of 1992 rolls around, people are really wondering about the state of the economy in the United States. The economy was in a recession. The economy was in a serious slowdown. And George Bush's main opponent, Democrat William Jefferson Clinton, often just referred to as Bill, ran on a platform with the slogan attached to it, "It's all about the economy, stupid." And Bill Clinton really kind of hammered this point home. Now, what was interesting about this election was that a third-party candidate arose, pointing out the ineffectiveness of either Bush or Clinton's proposals on how to solve the economic problems that the country was wrestling with in 1992. And his name was Ross Perot. He was an American independent candidate and really kind of showed either candidate that neither of their plans was really going to work. What Ross Perot did not count on was something in the future, technologically, that was just around the corner, that was going to be a big boom in the American economy. We'll talk about that here in just a minute. The economy was in recession, and Bush's greatest strength, foreign policy, was regarded as much less important. And with the Cold War now over, Americans really were looking internally. And the presidential candidate who seemed to have answers that Americans most wanted to hear, at least in 1992, was Bill Clinton. And he won the election, becoming the next president of the United States, and would be the president for the remainder of the 1990s. This is just kind of a checklist of some things that Clinton did throughout his entire presidency. Now, in 1996, Bill Clinton runs for re-election and wins. And he wins primarily because he's able to work with Congress. A Congress that 2 years into his presidency, which we'll see in the next slide, really took a hit because the Congress was taken over, or I should say was elected. Well, let me back up. 2 years into Clinton's first term as presidency in 1994, his political opponents, the Republicans, are elected to a majority in both houses of Congress, which means a lot of what he wanted to do when he first ran as president, he was going to have to compromise. And he actually learned to compromise very well throughout the remaining years of his first term, and definitely during his second term. And these were just some of the successes of his presidency. He was able to reduce the budget deficit. This is effectively by cutting a lot of spending in the budget, and that meant that America's credit and ability to use its own resources was freed up by quite a bit. He was able to create a number of jobs through an international trade agreement with both Canada and Mexico, known as NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement. This essentially established a free trade agreement between our two neighbors to the north and south, meaning that either of those countries could sell things in the United States and they would be free of any additional taxes. No tariffs. He put forward a number of social programs that would aid working parents, single-family parents, or I should say single-parent families. He also passed crime bills meant to really tackle a rising crime problem in the country, mainly focusing around assault weapons. Now, as we mentioned before, in 1994, 2 years into his first term, mainly because of America's objection to a lot of other issues that came up during the early years of the Clinton presidency, a lot of Americans saw Clinton as not the president they had voted for in 92. Two of the big issues that he tackled first off, or that he was actually forced to tackle when he first became president in 1992, was his stance on homosexuals in the military. There had long been a ban on anybody who came out as homosexuals in the military. Clinton stated in 92 that he wanted to abolish that. Another issue that he wanted to take on was national health care. By 1994, because of strong objection to both of those issues, it looked as though two of his big social issues at home were dead in the water. And so a lot of Americans were scratching their head going, hey, wait a minute, who did we actually, elect here? Did we elect the guy who said it's all about the economy, stupid, or about someone who wants to create socialized medicine? Which is it? And because of that, a lot of Americans voted for congressmen from the other party, from his political enemies, the Republicans, much more conservative in nature. And led by the very conservative Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich, The Republicans in Congress created what they called a contract with America, which was filled with a series of more conservative policies. And they pushed those through Congress, often over Clinton's veto. By 1996, it looked as though Clinton was dead in the water, except when he finally was able to make a deal with the more conservative Republican Congress, passing a very, very important budget. In other words, a list of how Congress was going to spend taxpayer money, which came off as much more logical and much more of a compromise between the two sides. This was seen as a huge victory. The American economy was doing better than it had 4 years ago, and Clinton was easily able to win re-election in 1996. Where Bill Clinton sometimes faltered in his overall impression as president was in the area of foreign policy. In other words, how he dealt with other countries, foreign countries. And when we look at the various issues of the Al-Qaeda blowing up of the One World Trade Center, everybody's thinking, going, wait, they tried that before 9/11? Yes, they did. There was an attempt to blow up the One World Trade Center back in 1993. And it was a bomb that blew up in the parking garage underneath one of the buildings. It failed to destroy the building, but nevertheless, it was an attempt. In 1994, U.S. Army Rangers were sent in to engage Somalian-supported militias that were actually backed by Al-Qaeda. And so this was another engagement with that terrorist organization. It actually ended up costing a number of American lives. As a result, Clinton actually withdrew U.S. combat forces from that small country. In 2000, at the very end of Clinton's presidency, a U.S. combat vessel, the USS Cole, was bombed by members of Al-Qaeda supported by Osama bin Laden. This was when we started to hear of that name. And so here we had 3 different engagements with this terrorist organization in foreign countries, and it didn't really seem that Clinton knew what to do about it or how to react to it. And of course, this was a haunting harbinger of things yet to come. But by the 1990s, people had heard of Al-Qaeda. They knew about Osama bin Laden. And of course, at the very beginning of the next decade, they would hear a lot more. After Clinton's re-election, another issue threatened to really derail Clinton's his legacy as president. And that was when it was revealed that a young woman by the name of Monica Lewinsky had potentially had some kind of illicit relationship with the president. It wasn't really clear what that was for a long time, until it came out that Clinton had basically told this individual that if she were ever questioned about a possible relationship between her and him, that she was to lie about it. And the next question was, well, what kind of relationship could that be? Monica Lewinsky was an intern. In other words, she was a young college-age student that was working in the White House, learning about the different operations of how the White House worked, its office staff, mechanics, so on and so forth. It was discovered that a sexual relationship did and had existed between her and the President of the United States. The problem came was when she was asked about it, it was revealed that the President had asked her to lie about it. He had repeatedly stated in the media that he did not have a relationship with this person, and then finally came clean about the fact that, in fact, he had. As a result, the House of Representatives drew up articles of impeachment against Bill Clinton for what they call subordinate perjury. Perjury is essentially lying under oath when under trial. The House passed what were called 4 articles of impeachment. These are essentially 4 charges. When these charges got to the Senate voted to acquit Bill Clinton on all 4 charges. Nevertheless, Clinton ended his presidency having been the second president ever to be impeached by the House of Representatives. We're going to step away from kind of the more political issues of the 1990s and take a look at probably one of the biggest social issues that happened very early on. In fact, beginning before Bill Clinton was even president. In 1991, a man by the name of Rodney King was arrested for speeding and potential drug charges, all of which were actually true. He actually was a known drug offender, and he'd been caught, driving under the influence of those narcotics. However, when he came out of the car, he was surrounded by a number of Los Angeles police officers, and they literally beat him to a bloody pulp. As it turned out, the beatings were videotaped, and people could hear, and people testified to the fact that those officers were using racial slurs while they were beating him up. Now, these were 4 or 5, police officers all around a single unarmed individual. And they sent him to the hospital. And unfortunately, though, when the evidence of the videotape came to light, all the 4 white police officers were charged. And in the initial trial, they were all found not guilty. African Americans, mostly in the South Central Los Angeles area, rioted as a result of this evidence. I mean, here you had a videotape that everybody was watching. Sound familiar? Only this time, folks, the trial did not go the way that people thought it should. And for a number of days, that part of Los Angeles burned. Probably one of my best friends lived down in that area, and he watched as people burned and looted all kinds of businesses in and around the entire area. And it was really bad. The following year, though, a federal jury found that 2 of the officers who had beaten Rodney King were guilty of violating his civil rights, and they were sent to prison. Now, that was a separate trial, but it seemed as though, as far as this was concerned, the damage was really already done. Another social issue that happened during the 1990s occurred in 1993, and this is actually linked to another one that we're going to be looking at here in just a minute. In February and April of 1993, a religious leader by the name of David Koresh, who had founded a religious group called the Branch Davidians, it was discovered that in this compound, this kind of concentrated building area where they had not only living quarters but also where they had worship centers and a pool and all different stuff, they also had illegally stockpiled firearms. And when the Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms Department went to address this, the people inside the compound barricaded themselves in, and as a result, they were now going to be surrounded by these federal forces, otherwise just known as the ATF. The FBI also got involved here, and during this standoff between federal officials and the Branch Davidians, at some point, the standoff had to be ended, and so federal officials were able to breach the compound in order to arrest the people inside, and somehow a tear gas cartridge, when it goes off, it sparks, it ignites. It started a fire. And federal officials, fearing for their own safety, left. They got a number of people out, but 76 people, including David Koresh himself, chose to actually stay inside the building and burn to death. This took place down in Waco, Texas. And it really shocked the country, because here were people who, yes, they committed a crime, but then this very dramatic, violent, end are killed. A few years after the burning of the Branch Davidians in Waco, Texas, the federal building in Oklahoma City, downtown, was bombed. Almost the entire front half of the building, as you guys can see in that top picture, was blown off. And it was immediately suspected that the people who had done it were Islamic terrorists. As it turns out, they weren't foreign terrorists at all. They were domestic terrorists. In other words, they were our own people. As it turned out, Timothy McVeigh, a former U.S. Army soldier, and Terry Nichols were arrested for the crime. And as it turns out, Timothy McVeigh was motivated by what he saw as a blatant violation of people's rights in the Waco, Texas massacre that we just looked at. It's what primarily motivated him to do this. This terrorist attack by our own people killed 168 people, many of them young children. In fact, a very large portion of the part of the building that was destroyed housed a daycare center for employees in the federal building. Soon after, McVeigh was executed, and Terry Nichols, his accomplice, was given life imprisonment. But here was an example of, domestic terrorism. People who saw actions taken by the federal government as being unjust, and here was the extent to which they were going to respond to it. And it really is a kind of a shock to the system to show just how far people were willing to go. During the services for those killed, President Clinton really showed himself to be quite a healing force, talking about how we will stand against the forces of evil, even inside our own borders. Probably one of the most revolutionary things that happens during the 1990s, especially the very end of the 1990s, is the birth of the internet. And it started actually on the campuses of American colleges, where libraries would exchange information via the internet in order to essentially establish a network where you could find where other source material was if you were doing research by going to one library, and then they could communicate with several others. The military had also pioneered this connection of all the different branches of the military in order to better communicate with one another. The World Wide Web, as it was first imagined, actually started being used for the first time on the campus of the University of California at Los Angeles, my alma mater. And it was there for the first time that students were now able to access it as well. I remember when I was a college student in the 90s, I had access to what was called a Bruin Online account. And I put this on our computer at home, and for the first time, you could access stuff around the world. I mean, it really was an amazing thing. And that, that familiar dial tone that you would hear as the computer would use the telephone line. And this, of course, is when people started to get multiple telephone lines and different ways of accessing information. Digital information became such a huge thing. And now, look how much we use digital communication. Everything from our actual phones to email to texting to everything that now involves social media. I mean, it is just amazing the extent to which we now rely on the internet and how much www has become part of our lives. The World Wide Web. And the thing, it all started with some kid putting a phone down on a receiver that was connected to a computer, and the person on the other line said, "Shall we play a game?" If you don't know the reference, look up an old movie called War Games. It actually was done back in the 80s. Alrighty, folks. We covered a wide range of topics when looking at this decade, the 1990s. And so your summary paragraph also needs to cover those topics. Remember, it only is just one summary paragraph that you're using here. You don't need one for every topic. You just need one that covers all three topics. Make sure that it is original, that you're putting this in your own words. Make sure that it is covering the whole PowerPoint and not just, copying and pasting different things from different slides. It is a summary. It is a wrap-up of what we've looked at here concerning the 1990s.